Welcome to the Shrine of Remembrance podcast, exploring all facets of our wartime history. Today, Shrine Curator Kate Spinks will take us on a tour of our special exhibition, Through the Eyes of the Sun, a John Williams retrospective. This is a visually enhanced podcast, so depending on your podcasting app, you should be able to view the artworks we are talking about whilst listening to the audio. Alternatively, you can listen and view the artworks through the link to our website in this episode's show notes. Or better yet, come into the Shrine and listen to this podcast whilst you're in the exhibition space. The exhibition is open daily in our galleries from 10 a.m, with last entry at 4:30 p.m. Now, it is my great pleasure to hand over to Kate.
Through the Eyes of the Sun is a photographic exhibition by an important Australian photographer, John Williams. He was born in 1933 and he died a few years ago in 2016. His work is held in collections like the National Gallery of Australia, the NGV and the Art Gallery of New South Wales. He's probably better known for his street documentary style photography. The war-related photographs that we have on display in this exhibition make up just a small portion of his photographic career. So as well as documenting life on the streets in Melbourne, Sydney and actually all around the world, he did quite a bit of travelling and did quite a lot of photography internationally as well. He intermittently spent time exploring the impact of the First World War. He was also a historian and academic, and he wrote probably about half a dozen books on the impact of the First World War on Australian society and culture as well as other subjects. He was quite prolific and the impact of the First World War was something that was a common thread throughout his whole career, both as a photographer and as an intellectual. Reading his books, you really get a sense of some of the ideas that John Williams was exploring, both through his writing and through his photography. I think really he wasn't afraid to ask difficult questions about the impact of war, and those questions run through the photographs that we have on display here. And I'll sort of describe some of those as we move through the exhibition. John became interested in the First World War because his father was a veteran. So his father served with the British forces, and after his service he came to Australia for health reasons. So he'd suffered from a mustard gas attack and he'd been wounded in the stomach quite badly and was really quite lucky to survive. And for health reasons, he wanted to move to a warmer climate. He met John's mother here in Australia, in Sydney, and I believe that she was a professional dancer. And John's father was in his 50s when they had John, and John describes that he always felt like his father was an old man, although 50 is really not that old these days, I guess, but to a young boy, he probably did seem old. And I imagine that his father was also probably very much battle-scarred, as well as suffering ongoing health problems from what he experienced during the war. John became interested in the effects of war through his father's experiences, although his father, like many veterans now and in the past, didn't talk about those experiences much with John or his mum. And I think this quote from John encapsulates his relationship with his father and his father's reluctance to talk about what he'd experienced during the war. He said, "In the 30 years we shared, my attempts to draw him on his wartime experiences were mostly met with stony silence. The real business of war was too nightmarish to resurrect, and something, moreover, only those with first-hand experience could understand. He had no time for non-combatants who formed judgments from rubbish in the newspapers or from books and patriotic events that he felt glorified the unspeakable." John said that he got tidbits of his father's wartime experience over the years, but this was mainly through conversations that he overheard between his father and his uncle, his mother's brother, who had also served in the First World War. He'd served with the Australian forces. And apparently at Christmas time, the family would get together and his father and uncle would have a few home brews and be sitting around the lounge room and, sort of end up talking quietly to themselves about their wartime experiences. So John didn't really have a deep understanding of what his father had experienced, and it was probably sort of later in his life, in his 20s or 30s, when he went to France on a holiday and was touring around areas of the Western Front, when he recognised names of places that I guess sort of sprung up from his memories of his father talking about his time at war, and I guess this sparked a creative drive and interest in unpacking the war and the wartime experience through his photography and writing, and sort of thinking about his father's experience. This exhibition came about because Jean Curthoys, John's third wife and widow, thought that we might be interested in some of his war-themed photography, which of course we were. So we are lucky to have acquired a range of examples of his work that deals with this theme. And in putting together the exhibition, I chose some more well-known war-themed photographs that John took. So photographs from his Anzac Day series, for example, and some montage works that are probably more familiar and have been in other exhibitions over the decades and are held in other collections. But Jean also mentioned that she had some contact sheets of photographs that John had taken that, as far as she was aware, had never been printed by him and had never been on display before. So we had a look through those, and there were some really beautiful photographs that he'd taken during one of his many trips to France and the Western Front. Quite a number of the works in this exhibition are photographs that he took as part of that series, and they've never been on public display before, so we're really excited to be featuring them in an exhibition at the Shrine of Remembrance for the first time. So the photographs, the newer photographs that we feature in the exhibition, we believe he took in 1991 on one of his many trips to France. And at that time, he and his second wife, who was also an acclaimed photographer, Ingeborg Tyson, had an artist residency in Paris, and they spent some time on the Western Front where John documented various memorials and sites that relate to the First World War. In the first couple of photographs in the exhibition, we have some images of John and his friend Deborah Williams, who was once a student of John's. And Deborah met Ingeborg and John during this trip they took to France in 1991, and spent some time with them and toured around sites around the Western Front with them. So we've got a photograph of John and Deborah, and most likely that photo was taken with John's camera by Ingeborg. This image here is of his father, Frank Williams. This is a very striking image where he's experimented with using this montage technique where he's overlaid several images. In this particular one, we've got sort of like a torn image of his father's face overlaid with a map of the Western Front and areas where his father was fighting. His father had very specific ideas and sort of personal responses to the war, and things like Anzac Day and other sort of commemorative events. Frank never attended Anzac Day parades, and neither did John's uncle. Both of them, from what John has written and said, felt alienated from Anzac Day. And that probably is not an uncommon feeling or experience for some veterans, both veterans of the First World War back then, but also current serving men and women or more recent veterans. For John's father, it was sort of like a double alienation in that he was British, so he felt that he was excluded from Anzac Day already, but also he wasn't keen on events that he felt glorified the unspeakable, which are his words. And I guess he just didn't want to relive those experiences in that kind of environment or format, and it didn't sit right for him with respect to his own personal experience. And yeah, it's interesting that John's uncle felt similarly, apparently. And John adopted some of these ideas and ways of thinking about the impact of war and how we commemorate and remember. He was very interested in unpacking some of those ideas through his work, both in his photography and in his writing. One of the first ways he started looking at the subject of war was through his Anzac Day series, where he went to Melbourne and Sydney and photographed veterans and crowds at Anzac Day events. They're incredibly striking images, many of them, and there's many layers to them. I think the longer that you look at them, the more you get from them. I have to say, when I first saw this image, I saw a very sort of staunch looking veteran, maybe a bit hard-nosed, there's a cigarette in his mouth, he's gazing off into the distance. And the more I looked, the more I saw the emotion in this man's eyes. When you start to look at him more closely, you notice the downturned mouth. There's a great deal going on there that John has captured. I think at first glance you maybe don't see that, but the more you look, the more you see the deep emotion sort of etched in this man's face and his physical features. I mean, we don't know what any of these veterans in these photographs were thinking at the time, but I guess what John does is he invites us to wonder and think about what it is they might be feeling or thinking in that moment. And I guess also the photographs are asking us to reflect on the individual veteran's experience of remembering and commemoration. John is able to capture a very sort of natural look in his photographs. Most of the people in his photographs are not looking at the camera, and they don't actually even seem to realise that John is there taking a photograph of them. And he's captured a very natural sort of moment that if any of us had been there at the time would have seen, in our own in a glance, I suppose. There's sort of no judgment through his lens. He's just capturing the moment as it is, and I think that's a really beautiful element to his photographs of people. As a photographer, he's quite anonymous, really. This other photograph was taken in 2003, and it's quite a tragic image, really. This man looks like a skeleton. He's sort of wasted away. He's obviously very elderly, and it's quite amazing that he's actually attending this Anzac Day event. He looks like he's deep in thought and possibly in both emotional and physical pain, probably as a result of his wartime experiences. This other one here, there's a homeless man who's glancing up at this veteran smoking a cigarette. And this one, there's something a little bit humorous about it, I think. You've got this homeless man sort of looking up with a very sort of quizzical expression on his face, and maybe, wondering, what's his story? The way the exhibition's themed is to sort of move from this Anzac Day series through to later photographs that deal less with the individual veteran and more about how, as a collective, we go about remembering and the sort of collective experience of commemoration. So the second series of photographs, I've themed that under the title Peeling Back the Layers. So these are examples of more montage works that John did. He's overlaid several images, and you can see some of them have photographs of soldiers overlaid with maps or propaganda postcards, historical writing, images of death and destruction. Some of them you have to look quite closely to sort of see the different layers. In this one you can see soldiers sitting in the trenches, but behind them is very sort of ominous. There's a sort of massive tank rolling in over the top of them. And there's another image sort of layered on that one as well, which if you look closely is images of skulls. So he's sort of layering propaganda and reality, the administration of war and the human cost, and I guess sort of inviting us to think about the impacts of war and the way war has been narrated, was sort of narrated at the time, perhaps through media reports, how it's been written about in historical writing. He's sort of, looking at the personal experience versus, letters sent home, the kind of censored information where, people didn't perhaps talk about the detail of what was actually happening on the front. In the next theme, Sites of Remembrance, we have a number of photographs that were all taken as part of this trip to France that I mentioned in 1991. In the first series of images, we see photographs of well-known memorials, war memorials in France. So John's taken photographs at the Australian Cemetery Memorial at Fromelles, the Memorial Stone and National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux, and the Fricourt German Military Cemetery. I think John had a bit of an uncomfortable relationship with these grand memorials. He felt as though there was an element of glorification going on, and that they were very imposing on the landscape and perhaps unnecessarily grand. Despite this, he's taken these very beautiful photographs of them, and I think it's interesting because he hasn't taken a full photograph of the entire site or memorial. He's focused in on just a small section, and you almost feel as though you could be standing there looking at the site yourself, that you could be looking at this with your own eyes. They're really poignant and very beautiful images, and they have a sort of stillness to them. And these are sites that, especially today, are highly visited, and it would be very hard to get a photograph where there are no people. So in John's photographs that he's taken, there's no people. The next section of photographs is titled Death, the Common Theme of War. The first image is of gates to the Fricourt German military cemetery. And then you've got photographs of 3 German soldiers' graves, and then the last photograph in this series is a small memorial or a gravestone for some French soldiers. I haven't been able to identify where this particular memorial is, but it's quite unique in that this particular gravestone, it's obviously commemorating, or a memorial rather, for a number of different soldiers, and on this single gravestone there's a series of photographs of each of the soldiers that is buried there. These little photographs they have a description of each of the soldiers, and they're quite moving. I think the images are fading, and the weather has eaten away at some of them, and it was quite hard to make out the names of many of them. I was able to make out one name, and I actually found the service record for this soldier, and it had some amazing detail in it, even recording the location of where this soldier died, but it didn't tell me where he was buried, so I still haven't been able to figure out exactly where this memorial is, but I would be definitely interested to know if anyone happens to recognise it. So I think in this series John was contemplating that death is the common theme of war. Nobody escapes it. It doesn't matter what side you're on, and everybody suffered terribly as a result of conflict. In the photographs of the German soldiers' graves, you have 2 or 3 soldiers buried in the same spot, and that's not uncommon. Sometimes they weren't even able to identify the bodies. And when you see the sea of graves in a cemetery like this, it's just a tiny snapshot of just how many people lost their lives. And I guess the photographs that John has taken in this sort of series of images are a reminder of the human cost and the human story. The people who died, they had families who were left behind, and it kind of highlights also the importance of for them to remember their loved ones. And I think seeing the photographs going back to the photographs of the French soldier memorial, seeing the photographs of these men highlights that these were real people who had lives that were cut short. The last series of images is themed around the concept of changed landscapes. So the first image is of bullet marks on columns of a building somewhere in France. Evidence of the First World War are still there, even in 1991 when John was taking this photograph. In the second image we have graffiti on a wall, possibly made by French soldiers, but we don't know. The translation for the graffiti is "good for the reaper," and whatever it meant then, it certainly has layers of meaning now. We have another image here of a gravestone in an unknown location, and you have sort of like the land reclaiming the environment which was once a battlefield. The last photograph in this series is of a very well-known location, Lochnagar crater, and this was created after a mine was detonated by the British at the start of the Battle of the Somme. And, this really sort of highlights, how the environment is sort of forever scarred by the war, and the war has sort of forever made a mark on the landscape. And I think that this last series of images really sort of feed into a conversation that John Williams is having around the impact of war and that the mark it makes on individuals and societies and physical landscape as well.